The air on the 42nd floor always carried the same faint perfume, lemon polish, ozone from the windows, and a faint papery tang of contracts that had not yet been signed. That morning, the scent had an edge, sharp like a blade, because we were counting down 48 hours until a closing that would reprice a region. 48 hours until appendices and handshake clauses and years of tacit promises consolidated into a single inked line. I had lived for mornings like that for 15 years. Quiet, precise, the world reduced to clauses and cadence. I was liaison for strategic partnerships. I translated legalese into the human promises that made deals survive. I was at the window, palms flat on the cool glass, watching the city tilt into focus. My blazer hung at that particular angle only because I'd just shrugged it on. Its fabric still smelled of the taxi I'd taken from the airport the night before. On the conference table lay a leather binder the color of old whiskey, soft, worn, inherited from a client who insisted that paper mattered, because paper was proof that someone had once held their promise. In that binder were my notes, a dozen pages of penciled concessions, names with little brackets, private, idiosyncratic things you don't type into a server because you trust the ink more than the cloud. Handshake coordinates, a private number that was not on any shared sheet. Cassidy came in like a wrong answer to a multiple choice test, perfectly coiffed, an expression practiced for cameras, and wearing a self-assurance purchased in quarters from the top floor. She was the VP's daughter, and the company had weathered that fact for years with the kind of tolerance that only money plus nepotism buys. She had been installed as transitional leadership the previous week, after her father decided he needed someone who would, as he put it, synchronize corporate posture. It was corporate wallpaper, friendly words, neutral voices, and then an unspoken permission to unsettle everything. She did not walk to the table. She arrived the way a headline arrived, sudden, loud, and immediately digestible. She swept her gaze over the assembled team, landed on me with a look that said she had read the memo of power and meant to redraw the map. "Cassidy," I said, more to acknowledge than to invite trouble. She smiled, a small, carefully rehearsed thing, and then did what I suppose she thought would demonstrate decisiveness. She raised her voice, crisp as a seal being broken. "Everyone, settle. I have an announcement." There are sometimes moments when the world narrows to a single pulse. For me, the pulse was the hollow sound of a conference room falling into polite silence. People glanced at one another. The CFO, Henderson, set his mug down as though it had betrayed him. The legal counsel looked faintly nauseous, possibly because lawyers sense risk like some people sense wine notes. My assistant, Sarah, who had been arranging a folder of meeting materials, stood a little straighter and gave me the look that says, "We'll cross this river as a pair." The room smelled of lemon polish and someone's expensive perfume. I thought, briefly, of the binder at my elbow. My fingers knew the weight of it even before I reached for it. Cassidy's announcement was a small weapon. She cited policy, the handbook velcroed to every HR orientation, an innocuous paragraph about decorum and company culture alignment. She spoke of a violation of professional presentation and the need for swift reassignment to preserve client confidence. Her voice was textbook, equal parts applause line and clap of a gavel. "Effective immediately," she said, "Emily will be reassigned from project lead to advisory capacities, pending an internal review." The room's reaction split the way a sea splits around a rock. Shock rippled. A few faces went blank. Others, trained to fill silence, started to maneuver. Phones slid from pockets. Manager faces rehearsed expressions of dismay and concern. My own heartbeat did something unfamiliar. It kept a steady tempo, as if it too recognized the professional choreography that follows an insult. It was not the demotion itself that landed like a blow. It was how public she made it. The reassignment was phrased like a kindness and given like a punishment. The handbook language was a blade wrapped in velvet, apparently neutral, undeniably punitive. As she read, the company's building access system chirped in the corner as if to punctuate the moment. My keycard had the polite courtesy of a small plastic beep. I registered the sound in the corner of my ear, and then, when the assistant handed me the printed notice and the HR representative offered the screen with the updated org chart, the beep ceased to matter. The facts were plain. My badge already had limitations applied to it. My inbox access to the confidential appendices had been flagged. The project leadership, my role, had been reassigned to a transition manager who had arrived an hour before, like a storm front with a name tag. I remember Sarah's hand on my shoulder, warm, certain. "We have the binder," she whispered. My thumb, without a tremor, found the leather strap and tugged the binder toward me. I kept my face neutral. It was the only currency I had left in that room, besides the binder. The face that said, "I see this for what it is." I did not raise my voice. I did not beg for fairness. I had never been good at spectacle. I'd always traded incompetence and timing. The reassignment triggered procedural consequences with a speed that made you suspect someone had rehearsed them in the mirror. IT sent automated emails politely removing permissions. Legal sent a note reminding everyone of the sensitive nature of the documents. Human Resources offered a calendar invite for an exit interview, which is corporate code for an interrogation in beige tones. My calendar, which for years had been a grid of meetings titled in the names of cities and people and clauses, began to look like an adult coloring book in which someone else had taken up the marker. When Cassidy finished, there was applause, thin, obliging, the kind that people clap when they need to prove their loyalty to whoever is standing nearest a microphone. Her father, the VP, offered a little paternal nod from the back of the room. He was smiling in the way men who buy favors smile, pleased and slightly amused at his own effective efficiency. The cogs turned. Communications drafted a memo, someone in facilities called security to escort my workspace transition, and the transitional manager started rearranging printouts, as if he had been doing it since birth. I left the conference room with my binder under my arm and the polite forms of corporate civility tucked around me like a shroud. People said things like, "I'm so sorry, Em," with the kind of rehearsed sympathy that never quite touches the true edge of the wound. The elevator's mirror told me less than the conference table had. The glass showed me my face, a practiced neutral that, if you knew me well, concealed the coil of calculation beneath. Outside the elevator, a facilities assistant closed a door with a key, imparting the final, ritualistic thud that said a threshold had been crossed. The first cascade of consequences hit within the hour. The project's shared drive returned fewer tabs than the morning had. The secure client portal denied me access. My calendar invites were reassigned to that smiling transitional manager. Emails I once used to nudge Tokyo partners into alignment now filled the holdings folder with polite CCs and for-your awareness disclaimers. Someone, no one and everyone, had quieted the channels I had relied on. In the corporate vocabulary, they had reduced my agency to advisory status, visible but marginalized, present but ineffective. The team's panic was a separate, interesting phenomenon. People who had never needed to act decisively in their lives suddenly needed to act decisively. Henderson, our CFO, who usually spoke like a ledger and moved like a bank statement, began to run numbers out loud, ephemeral and frantic. He leaned over the cluster of monitors in the trading room and muttered about valuation exposure and appendix misalignment. He was worried that a clause, the one I had negotiated quietly months ago with a client who prefers to be treated as an old friend, would be mishandled. He was right to be worried. There is a kind of worth that does not live in the database, but in the memory of a handshake, in the ability to interpret a partner's ellipses as intent. Sarah met me in the hallway near my office, her face drawn but composed in that way nurses are, people who know how to get you through a crisis without letting panic into the room. "They locked down the portal," she said. "Legal says no changes without VP approval." They pulled the executive contacts. "Which contacts?" I asked. Marcus Sterling's line is grayed out. My thumb found the spine of the leather binder again as if by habit. It was a small object, nearly silly in a world that worshipped servers. The binder contained a single sheet of paper folded into quarters, with a number in a handwriting that slanted like a map. Marcus Sterling was not a man you typed into a spreadsheet and ignored. He was old money with a taste for directness. He distrusted overproofing and preferred a conversation over cognac to 1,000 emails. He was the sort of person who, when you called, would answer, not because he had time, but because you had earned it by being the one person he trusted to understand what mattered. Sarah's eyes did the thing that said she knew what had to happen. "You can't just—" "I know what I can and cannot do," I said, "and I know what I must preserve." She nodded. "Okay." I retreated to my desk under the neutral scrutiny of overhead lights. I opened the binder as though opening a small safe. The paper inside smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. My handwriting looped and narrowed in places, a shorthand for years of negotiations. The number glowed with a significance that was both pragmatic and ethical. The contact was a responsibility, a covenant. It was not an asset to be sold. It was a promise someone had made to me in a private hour. It is important to pause here and be explicit about what I mean by leveraged. There is a difference between underhanded sabotage and the quiet use of relationships one has been entrusted with for years. My binder contained tacit knowledge, notes of conversations, a single phone number, the recollection of a meeting at a hotel bar where trajectory was agreed to over 2 Scotch neat. These were not secrets you could deploy to break the law. They were the private coordinates of trust. Using them would be inconvenient to some and inconveniently decisive to others, but it would not be criminal. That distinction mattered to me as a professional ethicist of sorts. It preserved my dignity even as I prepared to act. Outside, the office hummed like an anthill whose queen had been insulted. Phones chimed. Teams restructured themselves. I could feel the set of the floor change, small fissures forming in the polite marble. The transition manager sent an email announcing a reallocation of responsibilities with bullet points and an exclamation at the end, as if cheerfulness could mask the point of a knife. I sat very still and began to think like someone in a chess game who had been put into a corner but retained a rook. The binder at my side had a list of names and a single direct number. The thing about direct numbers is that they bypass the bureaucracy that feeds itself by pretending every decision is a committee vote. A direct number was a violation of centralized protocol, and that violation was its strength. There were legal considerations.
There were reputational ones. There were the practicalities of timing. The deal clock was merciless. 48 hours means that one misread clause becomes the difference between a premium and a write-down. It means that someone's career can be rewritten by an appendix clause mishandled by an inexperienced hand. It means billions shift, quietly, under the radar, because the people who understand the intangible terms were sidelined for the sake of a display of authority. I called Marcus. That sentence is both mundane and dramatic. I found his number folded and slightly smudged, as if it had been in someone's pocket during a storm. I thought about dialing and then about not dialing. The moral question did not feel like a problem in the abstract. It felt like a practical one. I was not calling to dramatize a grievance. I was calling because I had a duty to the deal, my deal, the thing I had been stewarding for months. The caller ID blinked with a number that did not show on any corporate directory. When he answered, his voice sounded like a room with a fireplace in it. Vested, immediate. "Emily," he said. He had that way of making a name feel like an acknowledgement. "Marcus," I said. I did not preface with anger or hurt. I did not dramatize. I stated facts. I'm temporarily reassigned. The transition leaves a window in the appendix handling. There was a silence on his end that was not empty. It was the shape of someone measuring a risk. "They demoted you?" "Publicly and efficiently," I said. "They've limited my access." In the background, I could hear the low murmur of the office, the rustle of printouts. Marcus took his time. "Do you have what you need to protect the appendix?" "I have partial visibility," I replied, "but the clause lives at the edge of human relationships. The counterparties in Montana don't react well to email policy. They react to people who keep their word." His laugh was small, a sound that might have been amusement or recognition. "You've always been better with people than with PowerPoints." I did not argue. He had known me long enough to be frank. "I'm asking to meet," I said. "If Marcus Sterling and I can speak before the deal is pushed through, we might close properly. If not, the risk is higher than I care to model." There was a pause. In that pause, I imagined the city below, the deal metrics streaming in blinds, Henderson running numbers and missing the signal my fingers could still read. I felt the shape of time, 42nd floor, leather binder, 48 hours, and knew I was at a pivot. "Come to the lobby in 1 hour," Marcus said. "I'm demoted," I started. "Come anyway," he interrupted, with the gentle decisiveness of someone who made his decisions in the room and did not wait for committees to pronounce them. "I'll be in the lobby. Wear something you don't mind being noticed in." He hung up before I could negotiate tone, because Marcus knew tone mattered less than presence. The line clicked dead, and the world resumed around me with the loudness of small animal panic. Sarah looked at me when I put the phone down. Her face had steadied into the professional calm of someone who understood the responsibility of the moment. "You don't have to go," she said. "I don't have to do a lot of things," I said, "but I have to be responsible for what's at stake." She reached into my briefcase and handed me a coat that had been waiting, my fall coat, the navy that reads both competent and intentionally neutral. Outside, the street smelled of rain and hot pavement, of a city that will take sound and spit it back as rumor in an hour. I took one last look at the binder. It felt heavier than it had at any point in my career, not because of the paper inside, but because of the stories it contained. Notes, promises, the small collateral of trust. I slid it under my arm like an animal, small and breathing. I crossed the street and took a table at a coffee shop that faced the lobby glass, a public hiding place. I ordered black coffee without ceremony. The cup arrived, steaming, and the foam left a ring like a halo on the surface. I set the binder on the table and opened it in front of me, not to take anything, but to make a small theater, the visible presence of private knowledge. It was a signal, perhaps petty, perhaps wise. It was mine to show or not. The coffee taste was admittedly good, bitter and honest. From my seat, I could see the 42nd floor's lobby like an aquarium. People moved below in suits, carrying the choreography of corporate life with all the seriousness of trained actors. Security rotated, reception smiled. Someone adjusted a floral arrangement with a devotion typically reserved for war memorials. I thought of the many times I had walked across that lobby, my heels precise on the marble, carrying documents that would decide futures. I watched Cassidy team move like a newly appointed cast, rearranging credentials and smoothing the edges that make people uncomfortable when authority is unsettled. They did not know yet that a private line had been called. They did not know that an old money CEO, who preferred to avoid public entanglements, might decide to walk into a lobby and make things inconvenient for those who preferred to hide behind memos. They were busy with the immediate spectacle, press releases that had not yet been written, talking points for an imaginary interview, the rehearsed outrage that looks good on a resume. I sipped coffee and felt the city press against the glass like a fact. I watched a narrative build below that, if left to itself, would likely untidy the deal. Someone at the table next to me was on a laptop, selling a startup dream to strangers. He had no idea what a boutique binder was worth in some people's economies. A busker played a saxophone on the corner, and his melody threaded through the lobby glass as if to make the city complicit in the moment.
Cassidy, for all her polish, was attentive to optics. She did what entitled people do. She tightened her smile and began to script. She told legal that she would call Marcus's office personally, that she would reassure him, that she would have the transitional manager read through the appendix with fresh eyes. She suggested that a quick corrective, an amended memo, a clarification, would settle any misunderstanding. The problem was that the appendix in question did not thrive on memos. It required the ability to read a partner's subtext, to soothe an old man in Montana who was suspicious of corporate reshuffles, to translate an offhand line into contractual intent. It was subtle work that an inexperienced manager could not fake without breaking something fragile. I watched Cassidy pick up her phone and begin the script she had prepared. Her fingers fluttered over the screen in that eager way people have when they want to be seen as decisive. She called Marcus's office. She left a message with a smile embedded in the sentence, a careful, practiced reassurance. She said she would handle the matter with sensitivity. He did not answer. Instead, an assistant, James, who worked for Marcus, called back within 10 minutes. He described Marcus as occupied and asked her to email. Cassidy pivoted to email the way someone pivots to a safety net. She drafted notes with legalese and polished assurances, CCing everyone who needed to appear involved. She did so in the lobby in the presence of the people who mattered, and for an hour the corporation pretended that would be enough. It would not. I could feel the floor's temperature change as professionals recognized that the response was inadequate. Henderson's voice sharpened to a saw. He began to publicly calculate the exposure and say words like valuation and contingency. The transitional manager, blessed with the illusion of authority, tried to reassure our partners in Tokyo, only to find that they, like many who have seen corporate theater before, valued substance over semaphores. In their time zone, it was already the middle of a calling day, and the interruptions we made were not the kind they welcomed. I closed the binder for a moment and rubbed my palms together, as if warming them against a cold I did not feel. The coffee steam curled like a promise that had not yet been kept. I thought of the moral cost of every decision. People who do what I do live under a constant calculation. When is leverage justified, and when is it vanity masquerading as necessity? I had been demoted in public, stripped of access, watched as someone attempted to remake the narrative. But I had a responsibility, to the clients who trusted me not for my title, but for my constancy. That duty gave me a moral clarity that made the actions ahead less fraught. I left my coffee half finished. I pulled the binder into my bag in a way that suggested nothing, casual, habitual. I walked into the lobby with the quietness of someone who has rehearsed small de-escalations for years. People looked up. Cassidy smiled the smile one uses when the room is supposed to be on your side. She spotted me and attempted the summit of corporate magnanimity in an ascendant tone. "Emily," she called, "so glad you could join us." I let her speak. I let her try to occupy me with her well-rehearsal. There is a power in listening to someone who believes they have already won. It allows you to find the exact moment their veneer thins. "Marcus will be here," she said, her voice pitched for the people around. "He knows how important this is to the partnership. We could all what? Sit politely while the wrong hands read a clause? Be a courtesy that erases years of careful cultivation?" She believed her tone would settle people. It did not settle me. The lobby felt suddenly thick. The fountain's water tinkled with the kind of indifferent sound that mocks human drama. People clustered as audiences do. Cameras would have framed us perfectly. The entitled young executive, the demoted professional who refuses spectacle, the busy staff trying to look busy. Somebody in facilities adjusted a plant, as if to stage manage the light. It was a tableau vivant of corporate theater. A man in an overcoat cleared the receptionist area, and James, Marcus's assistant, stepped into a brief conversation with him. The movement was small. The lobby returned to its hum. Cassidy, believing she had checked a box, moved to read a prepared statement. I stood a yard away, neutral, with the leather binder like a mute argument at my side. A voice came through the lobby then, crisp and calm. "Emily Sterling?" It was not my name. For an instant I thought there had been a misidentification. Then I turned. Marcus Sterling did not move like someone who desired applause. He moved like a man who had decided to attend a matter only if he could oversee the truth personally. He was not extravagant. His clothes fit as if tailored by someone who understood that quality need not shout. He looked like a man who had never been surprised by anything that wasn't interesting. He had his assistant, James, with him, a young man who wore competence like a neat tie. Marcus's eyes scanned a lobby and finally settled on me with a recognition that was both polite and particular. He nodded as if to say, "I was hoping you would be here." Cassidy's face changed in fractions of a second. She had rehearsed for an email answer, not for a human response. Her smile tightened. Her posture momentarily lost equilibrium. That small shift, in accidental honesty, was all an audience needs to register that something is off. Marcus crossed the room with the casual assurance of someone going to sit in a chair whose cushions had known his elbows many times. He did not hurry, he did not make a scene. He asked, "Emily?" as if confirming a prior appointment.
"Marcus," I said, the single word carrying years of negotiations condensed into a meeting. He glanced at the transitional manager, at Cassidy, then back to me. He did not remark on the demotion. He did not need to. He had seen the effect of administrative decisions before, plainly, in numbers and in people. He said, "We should talk about the appendix." It felt like a stage direction, not a revelation, not a sanction, but a redirection of focus. When a man with his range says we should talk about a clause, the world tends to listen. Cassidy, who had spent the morning arranging optics, found herself watching as her pre-tried script lost steam. She attempted once to regain control with a statement that referenced company procedure and due oversight. Marcus's smile in response was not cruel, merely exact. "Procedures," he replied, "are useful when they serve the deal. They are not a substitute for judgment." There was no need for him to say more. The lobby had already bought into the nuance of a man who valued judgment over paperwork. People around us began to reframe what they had accepted a moment ago. Henderson's jaw unclenched with the relief of a man who sees a better path. Legal straightened as if they were suddenly relevant in the way they wanted to be. I felt the current of the room turn. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a hint. Leverage, when used with an ethical backbone, has a way of reorienting the stage. Marcus and I spoke in halting phrases then, the kind of coded business small talk that contains more meaning than it pretends. He asked a few quiet questions that betrayed a familiarity with the people named in my notes, and I answered with the care of someone presenting a map to a person who had been lost before, but knew how to be found. I did not try to humiliate Cassidy. I did not need to. The contrast was its own correction. A simple presence and a single sentence, size, tone, time, can be an arbitration. When he stood to leave, he turned to me and said only one thing: "Stay by your phone." It was a small command, almost protective, and entirely decisive. He offered not intervention, but an opportunity for me to meet responsibility with him. It left the lobby with its fountain and its plants and its human actors, and as he stepped out, the world resumed its particular anxieties. Cassidy, for her part, tried to smile at the new arrangement, but the smile had a debt now. The day continued with its frantic calls and draft memos, but under them sat a new variable. Marcus had seen the problem, and his attention is not a thing that companies can easily offset. I crossed the street back to the coffee shop and took the seat I had left. The binder felt heavier now,
but not because of the paper. It was the gravity of a thing in motion. The plan, if one can call it that, was not revenge. It was a defense of what needed stewarding. I had been demoted in public, yes. My access staggered, yes.
But in that act of public humiliation, someone had made a miscalculation. They assumed authority without the competence to hold it. That arrogance was not something I wanted to accentuate cruelly. I wanted to correct it, quietly and irrevocably, with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. If you enjoy a story where the underdog finds an elegant way to claim what is rightfully theirs, hit subscribe. Sometimes the slow clock of justice is simply good timing and an unwillingness to be led by spectacle. I sat and waited, watching the lobby like a small theater in which the actors rehearsed their lines. Cassidy moved through the room with the energy of someone trying to manufacture calm. Henderson made phone calls that sounded like chess moves. Legal drafted clarifications. Someone from communications prepared a statement. Each of their actions was an attempt to restore the narrative they'd lost the moment they tried to punish without cause. But there was one immovable fact under all this. The appendix required a human hand that could read the nuance of a Montana partner who trusted promises more than press releases. You cannot, in 2 hours, manufacture the history that makes trust. You can only remind people that history exists and that a person who understands it had been present and then removed. I thought about the history that sits in a number, Marcus's number, about the time he had given me a chair in his office to explain a clause over 2 scotch, about the way he said, "You understand how the world values a promise, Emily. It is why you are where you are." Those were not statements made in the moment of victory. They were instructions in stewardship that only later proved their worth. An hour became 2. My phone buzzed once and then twice. James texted, "Marcus is running late." Then, with a small note, he added, "Marcus wants to hear from you before he speaks to the board." That line was not public, but it was decisive. It meant he had decided the matter was not merely procedural. It meant he wanted to adjudicate by his own standard. The lobby windows reflected people with a clarity that belied their intentions. Cassidy was halfway to the stage when she realized the public was no longer buying her script. I sat, sipping now cool coffee, aware of the quiet potency of my choice not to be spectacular. Calm breeds a particular kind of influence. People need something steady to fasten to when storms appear, and in many settings, steady is the kind of quiet that turns into a platform. When James came back, he walked across the lobby with the kind of pace that suggests good news, and with eyes that have seen 1,000 small crises resolved by the right intervention. He stopped at my table, close enough not to be overheard by Cassidy's crowd. "Marcus would like to invite you to speak privately," he said. "He'll be here in an hour. He asked me to leave a note. Bring whatever you think I should see." It was a formal ask, wrapped in a casual delivery. It was what I had hoped for, and what I had feared. There would be a conversation, a chance to correct the course. There would also be a spotlight. I put the binder in my bag, my fingers tracing the leather as if to bless it. The coffee shop's lighting softened, and the city outside kept its indifferent rhythm. This was the hinge of something that might bend either toward vindication or further complication. I felt the old cold that comes before decisions, the small intake of breath that professional moments require. I did not feel triumphant. I felt resolved. I had been demoted publicly in a way that could have been humiliating and career-ending if mishandled. But humiliation is only a state if it is allowed to be one. If it is converted into a plan that centers duty rather than vengeance, it can become a pivot. I stood, smoothed my coat, and walked back toward the lobby. The binder lay like a quiet argument against the noise of the day. People looked up as I crossed the marble. Cassidy's smile faltered. The transitional manager tried to readjust his tie as if that could anchor him. Henderson's eyes met mine briefly, and in them I saw the calculation of someone who realizes that the currency of certainty has shifted. I placed the binder on a low table by the reception desk. No dramatics, no spectacle, just presence. And waited as Marcus arrived, the man who had decided he would rather adjudicate than delegate. He took his place in the lobby with the unhurried gravity of someone who knows how to weigh human capital against numbers on a spreadsheet. He did not need to make a speech. His presence functioned as an argument in itself, that a decision made in haste and spectacle does not hold when judged by competence and context. Cassidy moved toward him, and for a moment the world narrowed to the two of them, to the dynamic that had been set in motion by entitlement meeting judgment. The transitional manager prepared his notes. The lobby inhaled and held its breath like a room awaiting a verdict. I stood beside Marcus, the binder at my side, the city pressing against the glass, and thought about the moral arc of this morning. It was not obvious then how it would end.
There would be questions, reputational risk, and the inevitable fallout. But there was also a chance to convert humiliation into clarity, entrench competence into authority, and to remind a company that titles are hollow with the people who give them meaning. He looked at me once and said simply, "Tell me the story." I began, and as I did, I felt the familiar rhythm of explanation settle over my voice. I spoke of Montana, of a handshake exchanged in low light, of a clause whose intent could not be captured by a typed paragraph and a procedure. I spoke quietly, with the precise language of someone who understands both law and human nature. Around us, phones recorded and eyes listened.
The lobby stilled enough for a man like Marcus to hear the shape of the truth. The moment was not yet resolved. What happened next would hinge on the kind of judgment Marcus preferred, and the willingness of a company to admit it had mistaken optics for competence. My demotion had been intended to silence me. Instead, it had been the spark that illuminated the fact the company had misread what it needed from its people. I could feel the sting of being publicly reduced, but what I felt stronger was the steadiness of an ethic that compels one to act, not for revenge, but for fidelity. The binder tasted like a promise to keep. As I closed my mouth on the last sentence and the lobby absorbed the resonance, Marcus folded his hands and considered what I had said. Around us, the crowd exhaled in the kind of breath that signals a turning point. Enough people had seen the miscalculation to start recalculating. He looked at Cassidy then, and the look he gave her was not a theatrical condemnation, it was an assessment. She understood in that sliver of time that optics alone do not satisfy judgment. She also understood that a man like Marcus was not going to let an appendix be mishandled for the sake of a display. "Let's have the meeting properly," he said. It was an invitation, not a sentence. It meant there would be a hearing, and that the hearing would be guided by someone who had the weight to tilt outcomes. It meant my role in the next 48 hours could change from passive to central. It was a small, precise correction in a world that wanted drama. I did not yet know how the board would respond, or whether the company would acquiesce to what Marcus proposed. I did not know whether Cassidy's father would step in or protect his daughter, or that the transitional manager would find his instructions insufficient. What I knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes from being 6 steps ahead in a complicated negotiation, was that the binder in my bag was not merely paper. It was the record of obligations people had made, and a reminder that some promises are kept because someone takes the trouble to steward them. People in the lobby began to drift away like flocks rearranging themselves after a storm. The fountain's water kept its indifferent rhythm. Marcus and I moved off into a small meeting room that opened off the lobby, one of those neutral spaces that companies rent out when they want a room without a history. I left the rest of the cast to their devices, Cassidy to her rescue script, Henderson to his numbers, legal to their memos. The city outside continued to breathe. I set the binder down and opened it again, this time to the page with the number and the shorthand notes that would matter most in the next hours. The pages were a map. Marcus glanced at them with a kind of respect that is rare to find in men who do not need to pretend they do not care. "You're calm," he said simply. "Calm is strategic," I replied. He considered that and nodded, as if it were a truth he had already adjudicated. "Good. We will need your calm. If there is to be justice, let it be procedural and precise. Nothing theatrical." I agreed. He was right about the procedure. The world responds better to truth delivered with restraint than to spectacle dressed as righteousness. But procedures only work if someone enforces them with judgment. That, it seemed, would be Marcus's role. He folded his hands and leaned in. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee. It felt like a place built to moderate the extremes of an overexcited day. "Let's start at the beginning," he said. "Tell me what the appendix means and why they've made a mistake." I began again, this time with Marcus's attention as a kind of pressure that made details matter. The story I told was not about revenge. It was about stewardship, and how the loss of a steward at a critical hour can cause an entire apparatus to fail. I spoke of human promises, of the specific kind of negotiation that trades in reputation more than in clauses, and of the moral implication of reducing that work to a line item. Outside, the lobby hummed with the kinds of conversations that would later be summarized into memos. Inside, time seemed to compress into a few ordered moments where truth and judgment could be measured like calibration.
The next steps would require tact, and they would require courage from people who would prefer not to be inconvenienced. When I finished, Marcus closed his eyes for a half-second. "We'll assemble the right people," he said. "No theater, just the people who can fix this in the short term and preserve the long term." "That is all I ask," I said. He tapped his fingers on the table like someone checking the rhythm of a small machine. "And Emily?" "Yes. If you want, I'm prepared to make an offer that values stewardship the way it should be valued. Not here, not now, necessarily. But value is a thing I can translate into opportunities." The words landed like a hand on a shoulder, unexpected, practical, and oddly comforting. To be valued in corporate terms is not merely to be paid, it is to be trusted with continuation. It is to be offered a station that aligns with the work you do. I felt the room tilt into possibility. There would be consequences, reputational noise, possibly a stock ripple. Cassidy's misstep had the potential to be costly, but it had also created a clear hinge. Once someone with weight cared enough to look, the truth is rarely left to the mercy of spin. Marcus did not want theater. He wanted first-hand corroboration. He asked simply, "Can we bring the counterpart on the line?" There was a moment of quiet that felt like a held breath. Cassidy smiled as though the answer would be scripted. The transitional manager clicked open a laptop, fingers moving with the nervous speed of someone who'd been promoted into improvisation.
Henderson hovered near, his face the color of someone weighing a balance that had just been tipped. Marcus took out his phone, and James stepped forward with the small efficiency of an assistant who knows how to avoid spectacle while enabling it. He dialed a number and held it to Marcus's ear for a second, then handed the phone over to the receptionist to place on speaker. The sound that came back through the lobby's ambient noise was not theatrical. It was a voice from Montana, dry, skeptical, and very specific. "We didn't get the email you referenced," the man said. "We had a gentleman in town 2 weeks ago who said he'd push the appendix along, and then we were told it would be a different point of contact. We haven't spoken to any interim manager. Who am I actually dealing with?" Cassidy's prepared lines lodged somewhere between intention and execution, the color that had been carefully maintained in her cheeks drained by a degree. She stumbled into a clarification that read like improvisation. We sent a note. I called Marcus's office and left details. Marcus's office gets messages that are triaged," James said quietly, in a tone that was not unkind but had the authority of someone stating fact. "We've tracked the exchange. There was a message, yes, but the partner on this line says he never received the assurances you claim." It was not an explosive denunciation. It was the simple collapse of a narrative under the weight of a primary source speaking with a patient, precise voice. The lobby, which had been full of actors finding their places, blurred into an audience that could read what was happening without theatrics. A miscalculation had been exposed. Cassidy tried to recover by offering a version that hinged on procedure, an email missent, a calendar error, a typo that could explain everything. Henderson, clinging to the last threads of control, began to compute the damage aloud. "If this appendix is misunderstood," he said, "we could see valuation effects across the region. We need to consider a hold." Marcus's expression hardened, not at Cassidy, but at the principal. "Hold," he said, "makes sense if it is a protection. It does not make sense as a punishment for someone who is doing work she is not qualified to do." His gaze, slow and exact, swung to the VP in the back of the lobby, the man whose familial pride had been the engine of Cassidy's elevation. The VP's smile wavered a fraction. The room sensed the displacement. There was procedure to be followed. There was also judgment to be exercised. Marcus asked to speak with Leeville and with Henderson privately, then turned to me and said, "Walk with me." We moved out of the lobby into a side corridor where the city's hum became a softer current. His assistant lingered near the reception as if to shield the exchange from opportunistic ears. Marcus's presence was steady, the kind of steadiness that arrives from a life long enough to have seen many small moral panics and many bigger mistakes. "What do you need from me to fix this in the short term?" he asked. "Time and the right people," I said. "Not the transitional manager, not optics. The counterpart needs a measurable concession I can explain to him that preserves his face and secures the intent of the appendix. They won't accept a form note. They want evidence of commitment and a human to speak to when things go sideways." He listened, and the lines at his temple softened in a way that suggested deliberation rather than indulgence. "I'll call the board and ask for an emergency review," he said. "And Henderson, I'll speak to him directly. This should be about correcting a risk, not saving face. We'll convene in an hour. Be ready to present precisely what you propose." We returned to the lobby, and I could see the way his move altered the choreography. People rallied around the idea that someone decisive had become invested.
Cassidy moved as if teleporting into a different scene, one in which she needed to accompany the narrative she had started. Her father walked forward, the paternal mask adjusted into the shape of corporate concern. He attempted a small public reclamation of authority, an assertion that the company had acted within policy and that any error was an unfortunate miscommunication. It mattered less because the company now had a man whose attention carried consequence. Marcus's role was not to humiliate, it was to reorient the calculus. He asked for the room the board had booked an hour prior, the glassed room on the 42nd floor that overlooks a city that assumes decisions are made there. People filed in with the hushed urgency of those in the middle of a crisis that must appear organized. Legal carried binders, communications carried prepared statements. The transitional manager carried the graceless weight of someone hoping projection would equate to substance. The boardroom smelled faintly of lemon polish, paper, and the kind of recycled coffee guilt that business climates produce. The light was bright and direct. Marcus took the head seat with the ease of someone used to a view, and when he spoke, it was with a gravity that restructured the room's attention. "Let's keep this narrow and factual," he said. "We will not rule on personnel in the moment. We will rule on the deal's path and on the facts that have endangered it." He motioned to me. "Emily, tell us what the appendix requires and what was lost." I spoke, and something in the room shifted, the way a scale tips when you place a careful weight on one side. I described the Montana counterpart's temperament, the history of small courtesies that sit outside contract templates, the one-off concessions that have clung to a partnership like a thread.
I explained, precisely, plainly, why a handshake and follow-through had mattered more than a line in a draft, and how a misread appendix could translate into a structural discount in valuation. As I spoke, I watched faces shift. Henderson's defense of numbers turned inward into the calculus of reputation. The legal counsel took notes that looked like understanding rather than posturing. The transitional manager attempted to interject with bullet points, but was gently, effectively, routed back to the point by Marcus. "We need to know, can your team execute the fix without further jeopardy?" He threaded the question with an implicit offer, the chance to be useful rather than performative, to substitute competence for ceremony. The transitional manager could not answer without revealing the depth of his inexperience. Cassidy could not produce the kind of long view that the counterpart required. The VP found his persuasive muscles suddenly less effective when the argument was not family loyalty but industry acumen. Marcus asked for two things: that the company pause any unilateral moves on the appendix, and that they authorize a small team, my team, to work directly with his office to confirm the partner's needs. He also suggested a controlled communication to the market, one that would frame any temporary delay as due diligence rather than disaster, because markets like narratives that have competence in them. Henderson, who had been calculating exposure all morning, rose to object. The conversation risked a public sentence. A pause might be read as a problem and lead to a market response. Marcus looked at him, and he said the kind of sentence that turns speculation into calculation. "We have a choice between a short-term hit and a long-term write-down. I prefer to underwrite the short-term clarity. If you instruct me, I'll take on the communication consequences and the valuation noise." Henderson swallowed. Numbers are people translated into tiny, fatal lines. Pride in numbers is rare because numbers can be wrong, and being wrong is expensive. Marcus's offer made the trade-off simple. Better to sustain a brief storm with a clear hand than to drift into an avoidable collapse. The board agreed, in the way boards sometimes do when one weighted voice makes a decision, with an embarrassed sigh and a set of motions that felt like relief. A pause was authorized. A team was appointed. I was given, informally, the mandate to lead the remediation. Cassidy's father's face fell into a quiet mask. It was not humiliation so much as recognition. Family privilege can only shield you so long when the currency in question is competence. Cassidy looked like someone who had been asked to play a part she had never properly rehearsed. There were immediate operational reverberations. Communications drafted a measured statement. Legal worked on the narrow language that would preserve flexibility without exposing the company to needless risk.
James, Marcus's assistant, coordinated the logistics of reaching the Montana partner and set up a three-way call. Marcus insisted on being on the call and on being present for the tone. We began the remediation with clarity and little fanfare. I spoke directly with the partner, acknowledged the misstep, and secured a path forward that preserved his dignity and the substance of the appendix. The partner's answer was not dramatic, it was pragmatic. We need to be heard. Once we feel heard, we'll move. That was all. A human need like that is not a procedural wicket you cover with an internal memo. It is a conversation, and Marcus's presence gave the conversation weight. By late afternoon, the active threat to the deal had been contained, in the sense that the immediate appendix misinterpretation had been addressed. Marcus had chosen to value stewardship, and the partner acknowledged the corrective steps. The company's communications team put out a brief, neutral, competent, that characterized the pause as targeted due diligence. The market's initial flutter crystallized into a minor dip. Headlines were careful. The worst-case scenario had been averted, at least for the moment, and yet the deeper consequences were social rather than purely fiscal. Cassidy's maneuver had displayed an appetite for power without the requisite gravity. In corporate ecosystems, that behaves like a wound that does not heal, because those who knew the wound would prefer to avoid the awkwardness of calling it out. Marcus had done the awkwardness for everyone, which had the effect of shifting where people placed their trust. After the board meeting, Marcus took me aside. He had listened to the remediation play out and had seen how people realigned. "You did what needed to be done," he said. Calmly, clearly, you reminded people why certain roles exist. "You stepped in," I replied. "You could have deferred." He gave a small, dry sound that was half laugh and half assessment. When your counterparty is an individual with a reputation and a memory, delegation looks like dismissal. I prefer to adjudicate directly when the margin is human. It keeps markets honest. He surprised me by offering something that was not purely transactional or opportunistic. "There is a role I've been considering for some time," he said, "one that values stewardship the way you described. It isn't at your current firm, and it wouldn't be small. If you were interested in leading a small group that focuses on preserving the quality of our regional assets, an office that sits between operations and relationship management, I'd like you to consider it." I felt a familiar economy of calculation. To accept would be to leave the firm that had demoted me, to step away from colleagues who had been a kind of corporate family, and to embrace the uncertainty of a new structure. To decline would be to remain in a place where optics had trumped competence for reasons of nepotism. Either choice carried costs.
"Why would you offer that?" I asked. "Because I've watched people send the wrong people to fight the right fights," he said simply. "And because I think there's value in someone who can reassert the importance of people who steward things rather than merely present them." The offer felt like a hand extended, not to rescue me from indignity, but to move me into a space where my work would have the station its value deserved. It was an elevation disguised as a pragmatic solution. I did not accept immediately. I wanted to be deliberate. Marcus nodded, which I took to be an acceptance of my need to choose with the same care I used in negotiations. In the days that followed, ripple effects emerged. The company's stock had an initial wobble, a modest market breath reaction to a pause in a deal of this size. Financial bloggers spun stories that traded on sensationalism. The press release that had been framed as due diligence was reframed by some outlets as leadership turmoil. The company faced questions from analysts that focused on governance and control. Those are the kinds of questions that can lead to real consequences. Conservative investors prefer steady hands, and a perception of instability favors discounting. But the more meaningful shifts were internal. The VP, Cassidy's father, found himself navigating an awkward truth. His attempt to consolidate control by elevating family had resulted in a near miss that required outside arbitration. He stepped back in meetings with a chastened posture. Cassidy, for her part, found that being the center of a cautionary tale is not a convenient thing. People who had tolerated her presence because she was a family member now found it harder to explain decisions that had risked millions. I stayed on the project in the trustee capacity Marcus had authorized, guiding the team through the appendix remediation and overseeing the partners' reassurances. My role became precise and visible. People watched me not as a demoted figure, but as someone with the authority of responsibility on my side. There is a particular kind of dignity that arrives when the work you do is recognized for its effect rather than its title. Henderson, who had fretted publicly in those first hours, shifted into damage control mode. He met quietly with communications to frame the company's narrative for analysts, and with legal to ensure the documents reflected the corrected pathway. He was not punished in any theatrical manner. Corporations prefer to correct mistakes without carnivals. The board's response was administrative and unequivocal. Cassidy's function was reassigned with more oversight. She retained position but not authority, an arrangement that preserved face but limited the scope for unilateral displays of power. For a week, colleagues treated me with a new kind of careful respect. Some offered quiet apologies. Others moved through their roles with a polite distance that speaks in organizations more clearly than loud gestures. I received an email from the VP, written in a tone that attempted reconciliation. I did not respond immediately. There are reparations of tone that require pacing. Swift apologies often read as calculations themselves. Marcus continued to check in. He had made a point, privately, of ensuring the partner felt heard and that the remediation held. He also, as he had hinted earlier, pressed an offer forward, a formal conversation about leading a stewardship group. The offer included a title that better matched the weight of the work and a mandate to build with a small team, people who understood the tacit infrastructures of deals, who maintained relationships, and who could act quickly when nuance mattered more than procedure. I considered the offer with the same deliberateness I'd bring to a contract clause. It was an escape from a place that had humiliated me and an entrance into a role that aligned with the work I valued. It also required leaving a firm that had been mine for years, a reality that carries sentimental costs, colleagues, and the small comforts of routine. But there comes a moment when dignity and the opportunity to exercise competence in a place that recognizes it outweighs the inertia of staying put. I accepted. The announcement was handled with the discretion Marcus had repeatedly favored: private conversations, a framed communication to avoid spectacle, a brief statement that praised my stewardship and explained the strategic rationale for the move. The company chose not to make the transition into a reshuffle moment of melodrama. It preferred to present it as a succession that preserved continuity. Cassidy remained in place with additional oversight. The VP, chastened, leaned into a quieter role. The market's reaction to my departure was muted. Some analysts framed it as an executive movement that would, in time, create more stable governance. A handful of commentaries spun the narrative as a story of corporate justice, an old-money CEO stepping in to correct a moment of entitlement. That kind of language brushes at melodrama, but beneath it is the more prosaic truth. Companies that attempt to privilege position over competence pay for it in credibility. There was, of course, private fallout. Rumors swirled, as they always do, some of them petty, some exaggerated. The company had to field uncomfortable questions at their next earnings call. They provided answers that were measured, and in many ways honest about oversight and controls. It was a time to be transparent and to accept the small consequences of correcting governance failures. Corporate accountability, when it happens, is not a theatrical purge. It is a series of small, messy conversations that gradually reestablish trust. For me, the payoff was less about the attention and more about the work. My new role required traveling to small cities where deals are decided in hotel bars and back rooms, where the currency of trust is not an email but a handshake and a consistent return call. I set up a team that valued tacit knowledge, people with the patience to listen, the humility to admit complexity, and the skill to convert relational capital into contractual certainty. Cassidy, to her credit, continued. People forgive and forget at different paces. Some will always prefer Power's company to the company of hard-earned credibility. The difference became that she had to work under a different set of constraints, and that her miscalculation would be a reference point for those who considered bold moves without the anchor of competence. There was also an odd consolation in the fact that the binder, the worn leather object that had been a symbol of an old way of doing things, became an emblem of something else entirely. It was not a talisman or a weapon, it was a record of obligations, a holder of trust. In a world that rushes to digitize everything, there remain elements that travel better by human studying. That is not a romantic preference, it is a practical reality in many negotiations. On my last day in the building where the demotion had occurred, I walked through the lobby with a different rhythm. The fountain tinkled in different water. People went about their business with the small dramas that sustain corporate life. I felt at once a dispassionate distance and a warmth that comes from a job well tended. The binder was no longer a thing I needed to guard. It was a ledger of a life that had turned a moment of humiliation into a pivot. Outside, the city smelled of rain on hot pavement, the same aroma that had accompanied my coffee the day Marcus first called. I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the shape of the decision settle in me like a completed clause. It is curious the way dignity accumulates, not in single grand moments, but in a series of choices that insist on responsibility over spectacle. Marcus's offer proved to be more than generous. It was a practical endorsement and an invitation to continue work that mattered.
The role gave me a seat at tables I had previously observed from the margins, and it entrusted me with the stewardship of relationships and clauses many had considered peripheral, but which are, in truth, the arteries of sustained value. When the dust settled, the company moved on with the hard work of governance. The deal, once secured through remediation, closed with a clause that reflected the partners' needs and the company's willingness to listen. The headlines became less interested in the human drama and more interested in the business implications, because markets prefer what they can model. As for Cassidy, there are nights where one reflects on the cost of being positioned by privilege rather than earned authority. She learned, as many do, that authority is easier to grant than to embody.
The company's response was calibrated, not punitive spectacle, but administrative correction, which in the long run is a more effective teacher. I took a moment once, some months later, to look out of my new office's window at a different slice of the city. The light hit the glass in a way that made everything look slightly less certain, and I liked that. People in my role thrive in ambiguity. We convert it into policy and presence. I kept the leather binder on a shelf, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Some things are better kept in ink, because ink carries a human weight that pixels cannot always bear. There is a tidy satisfaction in the arc of that morning, the demotion, the calm, the call, and the eventual correction. It was not revenge. It was correction calibrated by duty, scaffolded by relationships I had spent years cultivating, and given consequence by someone who could see the difference between optics and competence. That is corporate justice as I understand it, not a spectacle of retribution, but a recentering of value. I learned, among other things, that the quiet work of stewardship is the kind of power that rarely wants to be noticed, but cannot be ignored once it is gone. I learned that timing and patience, combined with a moral clarity about what is at stake, change the geometry of a problem. And I learned that dignity, once reclaimed, can be the basis for something larger than any single office. On the 42nd floor, people still polish the marble and adjust floral arrangements, as if to ward off the memory of what happened there. And somewhere in Montana, a partner still appreciates the call that treated his memory and his word as valuable. That, in the calculus of this business, is the kind of victory that quietly matters. If you enjoyed that, subscribe for more true feel workplace justice stories.